Professor Peevers.
Great. Thanks so much, Fiona. Can I just check you can hear me at the back? Is that okay? Great. And I'm just going to set a timer so I don't blather on too long. So I thought that what I would do is maybe talk for 15 or 20 minutes so that we could leave some time for discussion, because one of the most helpful things, particularly when you're used to thinking about and researching international law. Do you want me to stand at the back just so you can see me? Is that you can sometimes assume that things that you take for granted are really well known, and then there can be things that you all know really well that I maybe need a bit of an education on. So I thought that that would give a good balance to me kind of telling you a little bit about how I came to this and the wider contextualization of Orkney in the world from this sort of legal and peace and justice perspective. But then we could have a more fruitful discussion together about things that you'd like to share and that maybe we could explore further. So the title of the talk is Orkney, International Law, Politics and Peace. There's several ways into discussing those relationships between Orkney, global affairs, law, politics, economics. Tonight what I'll do is offer a couple of ways in, recognizing there are many other paths that we could tread. I'm also radically simplifying very complex movements and ideas, but hopefully to draw out certain threads that will be fruitful for us to think about together. So I wanted to set the scene first, a scene that occurs at the end of the Second World War. And this is just quite a helpful poster demonstrating the purposes and aspirations of what was going to be this new, completely revolutionary international institution. Now, for anyone who knows their history, you'll know this was not the first attempt. There was the League of Nations that had spectacularly failed, although it had achieved a lot in terms of institutionalizing some of the protections we still take for granted, like minority rights, refugee protections begin in this era, and everything else. But this was pretty revolutionary as a sort of standing organization. And within that preamble, there was this determination to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. The Charter was unanimously adopted in June 1945 after the San Francisco Conference, although the UN itself didn't officially come into existence until that treaty was ratified by a certain number of states, and that was the 24th of October, 1945. Now, the astute amongst you will notice that in that intervening gap, two earth-shattering developments happened. The first was the Trinity test, the first detonation of a nuclear weapon, which took place in the New Mexico desert. This land was treated as empty, but was in fact home to around 19,000 people, a little shy, I think, of today's current population of Orkney. These were largely Native American peoples who were given no warning about the test and who continued to suffer from the effects of radioactive fallout. The second was the decision to drop two different experimental nuclear weapons on the civilian populations of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, populations of around 350,000 and 250,000 respectively, larger than Aberdeen, for example. This new weapons technology fueled an arms race amongst the great military powers, and while there's no time to deal with any more detail tonight, the result was that a handful of states similarly detonated their own nuclear weapons, tests that were conducted on the peripheries of empire. The Western Shoshone Territory, within which sat the US Nevada test site, Maralinga in Western Australia, Montebello in Australia, Britain's first test of the Operation Hurricane in 1952, all inhabited by Aboriginal peoples, and then hundreds of detonations carried out in the Pacific Islands by the US, the UK, and France. These detonations didn't go uncontested, either by those specially affected by fallout, experimentation, and the horrific legacies and forced displacement from lands, or by civil rights campaigners who recognized the racist assumptions and imperial logics of such practices. And they were contested by emerging and connected networks of ordinary people, deeply concerned by what they saw as an inevitable drive away from this image and towards a new arms race that could only lead further away from peace. Whether they experienced the war as soldiers, workers, or civilians, the 1950s and 60s saw the rise of huge transnationally connected movements for peace. And here, Orkney was, like so many other places, deeply touched by the war in multiple ways you'll be far more familiar than I am and are probably told through generations. The movements that I've described harnessed the language of the UN Charter, but asked for specific commitments from those states. For instance, to ban nuclear weapons, a commitment that was made early on in 1945, and as we know, is only coming to fruition today with the recent treaty, which you'll note no nuclear-armed state has yet signed. More generally, there were commitments to limit arms production, including the arms industry and sales of weapons from the powerful states to around the world. This era, while being one of fear and tension, was also one in which major disarmament initiatives were pursued and some were successful. For instance, the Partial Test Ban Treaty of 1963 and the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty of 1968. Yet alongside these successes and the important groundswell activism that had pushed states towards these agreements, a proliferation in the arms trade contributed to this era being one of full-scale conflict, perhaps not within the Western states, but certainly everywhere else. The movement also was seen from the move from formal battlefields to the targeting of civilian populations. Again, we could spend all night debating the influences at play, but I want to highlight that the post-war era ought not to be understood simply as a bipolar Cold War contest between superpowers. It should be understood as being dominated by what was often called the decolonization revolution. These were national liberation struggles fighting back against colonialism that didn't end with the Second World War and often hung on for decades. And in fact, up until very, very recently, we had a decolonization committee within the UN, and it's still charged with acting for non-self-governing territories. So non-self-governing territories do still exist. So those would argue that that struggle has not ended. In that context of a decolonization revolution, newly independent states in what were often self-styled the Third World, so this could be used quite pejoratively by economic analysts, but actually a lot of the time this was adopted as a moniker with which people could identify a shared struggle. So self-styled as Third World actors or non-aligned countries. They were often hamstrung in their efforts for independence by the continuing presence of foreign interests. So either this was a direct military presence, that was the case, for instance, in Egypt. I've written a book about the Suez Crisis, and there was a huge presence along the massive canal zone there for decades. Or they were directly involved with states' corporate interests, so through something called diplomatic protection. This was the idea that foreign entities could be sponsored by their governments to go and conclude concession agreements with some of these states. Probably the most famous example you have come across is the Anglo-Persian Oil Company. It had a very healthy employee list from Scotland, including some of my ancestors. This was a British government interest, but it was run through a private entity, and the basis of that arrangement was a concessionary agreement with the government then of Iran. Such was the private interest that, in fact, in the 1950s, the International Court of Justice refused to hear a decision between Anglo-Persian Oil and Iran because they said this is not a state-based dispute, this is a private interest. So you can see that there were a real melding of state interests and private entity interests, and they combined into this notion that we could talk about separately of diplomatic protection. So as these new states grappled with this newfound economic sovereignty, they were also setting out on kind of welfare politics. So developing health, education, and other forms of social welfare that had been absent from the colonial regime. They nationalized numerous foreign interests, paying compensation according to legal principles. And again, this is very boring. It's very exciting for international lawyers, but there was a big contest over what was the required minimum standard for payment of compensation. Many of these third world states argued that it should be fair and adequate, And that was based on, for example, stock prices on the day that the nationalisation had taken place, because often these were kind of spectacular nationalisations. So those share prices were still quite high, and they would pay that rate. The Western states argued for a far higher, you can imagine, a far higher rate of compensation, because they had then lost a foreign interest in this industry. So there were these nationalisations of foreign interest paying compensation, and so much had also taken place in Britain. So those nationalisations became the fuel that drove destabilisation efforts by the US, in particular by Britain and France, across the world. And again, some of these stories will be familiar. From helping topple the elected Allende government of Chile, who had dared to nationalise copper industries, for example, and, as US government documents record, paid fair and acceptable compensation in doing so, to the toppling of Mossadegh, again elected in Iran, and the attempted assassination and illegal invasion of Egypt following Nasser's nationalisation of the Suez Canal Company. Many decolonised states fought back in a coordinated way, demanding what they called a new international economic order. So this was a highly legalised set of demands. One of those key legal demands was over permanent sovereignty over natural resources. This was an effort to equalise what had been massive imbalanced trade and to reduce foreign powers' interference in internal affairs. Alongside this economic activism was the continuing and coordinated work against settler colonialism. From Algeria to South Africa, from Palestine to Australia to Canada to the United States. This era was marked by solidarity networks drawn from within Indigenous communities, among workers and trade unions, peace campaigners, among the displaced and the dispossessed peoples. These solidarities included an oil embargo imposed by Arab oil-producing states as the illegal occupation of Palestine was maintained by Israel following the War of 1967, and the imposition of sanctions against apartheid South Africa. This was the background to what became termed the 1970s energy crisis, with soaring oil prices and a rapid escalation in the search for domestically guaranteed energy resources. The North Sea became a bonanza for the UK government because it became a net exporter at a time of massive oil prices, even as it generated a huge crisis in manufacturing. So we could think about the sort of contestations that happened over that. At the same time, the European community was working to promote regional self-sufficiency by funding, for example, the search for uranium among other energy resources. So uranium promised a similar bonanza. Prices at this time were soaring, in part because of the soaring oil prices. States were recognizing they had to move away from such a high dependency on oil into these other energy production places. There was also a price-fixing cartel, but we definitely don't have time to talk about that. So these prices were soaring despite the fact that there was increasing contestation around the primary sites of uranium mines. So again, you heard where these nuclear weapons were being tested. Here's a familiar pattern. These places included Indigenous territories in Western Australia, the Navajo Nation of Southwest United States, in Canada, but also in Namibia. And at this time, you'll know, so Namibia had been illegally annexed following the Covenant of the League of Nations and the mandate system that was imposed by South Africa, and an apartheid system imposed on Namibia. At this period, South Africa is being sanctioned. States are not allowed to trade with it. It is a pariah. Nevertheless, Rio Tinto continues its mining activities at the Rossing mine. This had begun in 1966. It came online in 1976, and in breach of all of these sanctions and international law at the time, the UK becomes one of the largest importers of that uranium, and that uranium finds its place in the nuclear energy, and that uranium therefore is still on UK soil. from this illegally operated mine. So in other words, there was not just a scramble for oil in the North Sea, there was this potential for a scramble for uranium as governments invested in nuclear energy. Now again, this comes with massive contestation by ordinary people, so not just at these sites of mines, but by people who would be directly impacted by uranium mining and also felt really strongly about the connections between empire and between militarism. So often this is through networks like the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, given the inherent relationship between nuclear weapons and nuclear energy. And again, there's a whole other thing that we could talk about in a minute. I think at the time that it was being developed, it was much easier to see the link. I think today people seem to forget the link that was inherent between nuclear weapons production and nuclear energy. And so the very basic but kind of unavoidable history is that the nuclear weapons program was the purpose behind. Nuclear energy was the sideline benefit. And that was known to all of these actors amongst the 1940s, 50s and 60s. There's an international law story that I could also bore you with about atoms for peace and the forms of proliferating nuclear energy from the nuclear states to the non-nuclear states. But again, I think that's for another day. So whilst I can't talk about those specific connections, there are other times where you have related groups bringing together their understanding of global politics. So for instance, the understanding about the anti-apartheid movement. So this was a poster from CANUC, which is the Campaign Against the Namibian Uranium Contract. It's kind of a sub of the Campaign Against Nuclear Disarmament. This was in the SCND, Scottish CND archives that are held in Glasgow. And you can see that the point being made here is that this is stolen uranium from Namibia, and that it is generating the nuclear reactors in the UK. So there were lots of connections and networks that people built upon. Or it wasn't just anti-apartheid. So although a lot of people were in support of that movement, there may just also have been kind of political beliefs, right? The different spectrum of ideologies. And again, you'll know much better the range of those within Orkney and the forms of politics and activism amongst inhabitants. I'll probably come back to one figure, but I will, just in case it's not as familiar to everybody. So the actual campaign, so these are two images. Well, so this is an image from Stromness Harbour, which it disappeared at some unknown date, and I'm not sure, but maybe someone can tell me. I have been asking, but it probably just got a bit old and weathered. But this was at Stromness Harbour. And this image on the right is a silent march that was held against uranium in Kirkwall. So on this slide, I've put a little bit more of the specificities of the background. So I've given you the scene, the kind of global scene, but the specifics here were to do with geological studies that had been conducted that had found this uranium seam around the Yesnaby to Stromness corridor. I've told you a little bit about the global politics there. And then there's an application to Orkney Islands Council for permission to drill test bores. Now, it should be said that there had already been contracts drawn up with some local farmers, about 40 farmers, so 40 landowners. But as it became clear that they were not just giving permission for testing boreholes, but they were also giving permission for mining so mineral extraction should uranium be discovered. So there were sort of dual things happening, which is a pattern that we see repeated, whether that's in a colonized state or in various other areas where resources are discovered, a form of extractivism that tries to divide. So get some rights over here, these people are paid off with a pittance, but more than might be their ordinary run-of-the-mill, and then suddenly you've got a community divided. You can tell me if that's something that's relevant as we come to bring the story up to date today. In any case, what happens, and this is slightly more complicated than I put it on the slides, but you get what's called a public inquiry, examination in public. And this is where local councils, this is where you have to care about planning laws. because local councils had these rights to, well, they had an obligation, in fact, to set these things called structure plans, so that when governments or corporations were wanting to engage in any kind of development activity, there had to be a sort of standing set of guidance for what would or would not be allowed. And number 3 of the amended structure plan in the wake of this initial application was inserted by Orkney's Island Council to say that uranium mining would be banned. So in other words, there was no point trying to go to the farmers and then put in a planning application that you were going to the council to say you were going to do some test bores, because the council had already got a standing decision to say no. That was the subject of the examination in public. So the Scottish Secretary ordered a recorder to come to Kirkwall and essentially to make a decision based on local impact, environmental concerns, hearing from a range of different associations, of which one, the Orkney Heritage Society, was key. So that's more of the sort of technical background to no uranium. I was just going to say one thing about coincidences and characters. So it's interesting that also within Orkney archives are some of the original pamphlets, journals that were created by Stuart Christie. So he was resident here for a short time, apparently induced to Sanday for the lack of a police force on the island, him being an anarchist. And so if you're not familiar with who he is, he was actually due to be executed by Franco's regime because he had gone over to assassinate Franco. There's a lot of evidence to say, as a young man, as an 18-year-old, as a young man, he was pretty sure that he had been entrapped, but he sort of went along with it anyway, I think, is the story that he's told. Anyway, he was granted a reprieve. He came back to the UK. He was part of something called the Angry Brigade. So they were involved in militant, so violent activities in London. And he was warned by special branch. He'd been acquitted of a particular incident, and he was warned that he would be fitted up and he would be going to prison. So he first left for Leeds, and then he came to Sanday. Anyway, while he was here, he set up something called the Cienfuegos Press, and this is him at the county show day in 1979 with his books and whatnot, and this is the press. Over the Water was his publishing house. But he wasn't alone. It's not as if he dropped into somewhere and was a completely unique character. So he worked with other local people in producing the journal and in also having the stall out on that county show. And of course, he's here right at the time of the no uranium campaigning. So just a really interesting thing about people and place, I thought I would just say. Other people that were really significant in the no uranium campaign, and I mean, I'm probably doing injustice to a whole series of people who were involved, because, for instance, there were 4,000 petitions that were taken to that examination in public, gathered from people all around the islands. But other figures were Ernest Marwick, who was the originally the Orkney Heritage Society lead, and then Marjorie Linklater took over from. So this is Marjorie Linklater on the left. Ian McInnes, who was the rector at Stromness Academy and the art teacher there, and George Mackay Brown, who I'll come to in a second. What's interesting, I don't know whether you can see, this hasn't come up very well on the blow up, but there was also a guy called Peter Maxwell Davis, who you may have heard of, a composer. So he composed what's one of the most famous classical tunes that you hear. I mean, I've heard it at many, many funerals. But that was composed for the St. Magnus Festival in June 1980 in the Yellow Cake Review, so specifically in response to this threat of uranium mining. And then you've just got this really beautiful painting by Ian McInnes of the cliffs at Yesnaby, which would have become, because of the nature of the mining, so the uranium was a pretty poor quality. It's actually not dissimilar to some of the Namibian mines. It would have to have been open cast. For the geologists among you, you'll know that any land that has uranium under it is slightly radioactive, because it is quite a radioactive metal. But open casting it would have also led to a lot of the what's called yellow cake. So the debris that comes off the metals, which are bound to the metals and which cause major lung problems, and even today are the subject of huge labour injustices and rights breaches in Namibia, where mines still operate. So that's just some of the figures that were involved. And then I said I'd come back to George Mackay-Brown. So this is his book, Greenvo, which is probably one of the more famous, at least of his first novel anyway. Interestingly, that was written in 1972, so there was no prospect of uranium mining at that time. And in fact, it was also pre-Flotter, because this is 1972, and yet so much of what's evoked spoke to them what happened in those confrontations and contestations. And the image, you can't see it quite so well on there, but that image is by Ian McInnes. And actually, Ian McInnes's daughter Fiona was saying that there are multiple versions of that text, of that cover. And again, they're in the Orkney archives if you want to have a look at it. All of the cartoons that Ian McInnes produced are held in the archives, and I'm very grateful that both the family and Orkney archives allowed me to reproduce them. So I talked about some of the linkages with global affairs. This one is a great one for expressing that. And if you can't see the words at the back, it says, "Hear not too much evil about South Africa. See no evil in RTZ," that's Rio Tinto, that's the mining company, that had also prospected in Orkney in the early 1970s. "Unless it comes to Orkney for uranium. Speak no evil about maximising profits from investments, and I'll make money for you from apartheid and leave you with a clear conscience." And that's someone singing a hymn. So that image, I think, was from 1990, was the image there. Then another, now this has quite a few local references that would need to be unravelled by those who are much more familiar with some issues, for instance, around controversies with Orkney ferries. So again, this one says, "Say nothing about putting the OLA out of business and making 100 more unemployed in the West." And then up here on the right, "Watch the ones that look like Orcadians." And then here, "Right men, your assault course is to get from the pier head Stromness to the library. There are tank traps, enemy fire and trenches at Argos. And a film crew have barricaded Graham Place. Use live ammunition." Now, the thing is, there are very real concerns here, because at this time you have huge NATO exercises going on in Shetland, in the Western Isles, right through the seas. So anyone who was a fisherman at the time would have confronted some of these closures of local shipping. And also there were staged invasions. And again, so I don't have time to talk about this, but in Shetland, there are particularly egregious exercises that take place, mainly around Unst and Saxiford. Sort of demonstrations of how to do a modern day D-Day, but in a better way, I guess. So these were live issues for the islands because they were testing grounds. They weren't just, trying to extract uranium. They were also places to, test a whole series of weapons. Again, I don't have time to talk about that, but there are all sorts of experiments that have gone on, particularly in the Western Isles, but also in Shetland with chemical weapons and biological agents. But they were also sort of fantasy places where you could do weapons firing and test all sorts of missiles. So this was what was being contested here. And then I guess the other is this idea that this was never just a story about UK policy. It was also always about American nuclear. And this comes from slightly later, I think it's 95, December 1995, American nuclear. And we want to give something back to the north of little old Scotland, the waste. So this becomes actually a bit more of a live story later on. So just what I want to highlight here, that there are these patterns that can be seen in dealings with colonised peoples across empire, but with notable differences here in Orkney. At least here, there were planning laws in place that recognised a local population, and there was legal personhood, something denied to local Indigenous activists. People also highlighted the dangers to all people from a global militarized system that could violate international law, banning countries from trading with South Africa. So the Orkney campaign saw this as something that was deeply inherent to the safety of themselves. It wasn't just about protecting this green island, as it was called, but they were deeply connected, and they saw a boomerang effect. So Césaire, who's a great theorist, a post-colonial theorist of particularly French and British imperialism, has written really powerfully, wrote in the 1950s about how when violence is committed in the colony, it comes back in the form of, as he wrote, Auschwitz and the Holocaust. So the things that are learned in the colonies come back to haunt the colonizer, and then get exacted in horrific ways. So that was an understanding, I think, amongst many of the campaigners, not just in Orkney, but in some of the other campaigns that I've looked at across Scotland. And some of these were expressed in publications that came out around the time, and again, expressed quite a lot of solidarity. Well, I'll just go back to that one, actually. So this was a publication from the Keep NATO Out campaign in Stornoway. It was published in 1980. It was actually a joint campaign between Hebrides Against Nuclear Dumping and Keep NATO Out. I think even Hand would agree that it was slightly more speculative at that time that nuclear waste would be dumped in the Western Isles, although it did become far more dangerously live as an issue in the later 1980s. But what was really at risk there was the development of a NATO base in Stornoway. And again, what was the evidence for that? A little letter planning application at Stornoway Airport. And it was just a couple of local people saying, huh, what does that say? Why are they doing that? Oh. Went to the local council, discovered that there had been this application to extend the runway, and started to understand that actually it was going to be much more than that. But again, you've got these brilliant images. This is from Malky McLean, who try and convey what was being lost of the distinctiveness of the way of life on that island. So in this one here, you can see obviously a peat stack. You'll have to get that thing dismantled, my man. It's a danger to low-flying aircraft. And then up here, I said you'll be sleeping soundly these nights, Murdo. What with NATO here protecting your way of life? And then down here, what do you mean I've been declared a security zone and you want to search my marriages? So these were just some quite interesting shared publications. And then just a little bit about the Keep NATO Out campaign, because there was this dialogue in particular between C and D chapters, so anyone involved in the campaign for nuclear disarmament. So in the 1970s, you have this application, it's rejected, and again, you get an examination in public. And again, there's a sort of in abeyance. So the outcome is ambiguous for both groups. What I didn't say with the No Uranium campaign is that the reporter recommended the removal, the deletion of the ban on uranium from the structure plan, but the Secretary of State for Scotland simply reserved for himself the decision should it come back. So there wasn't really a win, but there wasn't really a loss. It was just left ambiguous about what the political balance actually would be. Likewise for the Keep NATO Out campaign. So whilst it recommended against the extension of Stornoway Airport, the campaigners were really aware that they would have to keep up the pressure and keep kind of connecting with local networks. And I think that sort of brings me to some of the assumptions that seem to drive, at least in my field, peace campaigning, local movements, local stories, and their connection to global politics. You'll often see described, presumably you hear yourself described as remote, isolated, cut off, all of this language that has an inherent set of assumptions about connections to global stories. And in fact, these are just some, there's so many more within various of the archives that demonstrate that this just simply isn't the case, and that actually a lot of those networks just butt up against this assumption that we all live within these self-contained states, which, by the way, is, very modern development, and one that we might call into question on multiple levels. So, for instance, you get the North Atlantic Network, and this is a constellation. It does include some state representatives, so from Norway, from Iceland. Iceland is really active, actually, at the time. The Faroese, all states, but also non-state entities, so campaigning groups, peace groups, various other social movements who see a different set of concerns joining communities together. And that one between the sort of North Atlantic is a really powerful one through the 1980s and actually beyond, but you see a really high point in the 1980s and 1990s. And then here we've got the connections with Ullapool, CND, and the Keep NATO Out campaign. And you probably won't be able to read some of these names, but they're quite familiar in sort of broader Scottish peace movements. So Kay Carmichael, who was quite a well-known sociologist, was at Glasgow University and was a big peace campaigner. Angus McCormack, who I've mentioned from the Keep NATO Out campaign, and various others, and then lots of campaigns to, for instance, go north and protest against. So Vulcan is the base that's connected to Dounreay, for example. And then this picture is just lovely. So has anyone heard of Roger and Mary Gray from Skye? They set up the Skye Peace Centre. Roger Gray had served, he was a conscientious objector in the war. And this is a picture of their banner at one of the first Aldermaston marches. So they come all the way down from Skye. So the idea here is just to push back against this notion of being remote. And then if I had more time, I would talk a bit about what happens locally to that galvanized movement that's coalesced around uranium, and that would be to look at the Stormy Bank group, if anyone's heard of that, or the campaign against Dounreay expansion, CADE. So again, it brings in a global set of stories, one of which is probably relevant to know is just that up until the 1960s and 70s, it was not illegal for states, including the UK, to dump nuclear waste at sea. So this was practiced all throughout the Atlantic, particularly in the Irish Sea, actually. And then you get a London Convention that's signed, which bans this practice. And so the UK has a problem because it has to get rid of the waste and there's nowhere to put it. And one plan is to put it in the Galloway Hills, but unfortunately in 1979 there is a very unexpected earthquake. So having been previously told that these hills would be suitable for deep storage, that was kiboshed. And so they started to look to the sea to dump in containers between Orkney and Shetland, and that's how you get the rise of movements that connect those two islands. I probably would just like to say one more thing about one of the things that connects some of these island stories and highland stories, connects them in ways beyond mining, and more to things about the activities of the military infrastructure that sits right across and is actually concentrated outside of Faslane, and probably Rosyth is concentrated in the Highlands and Islands. And that has to do with land rights, or more appropriately, their denial. So it's only because you have hugely dispossessed areas and empty land that you are then able to adopt an MOD policy of testing, firing ranges, and various others. And despite the fact that after the First World War you get some of the most powerful land raids happening, again there's massive calls for housing and for land redistribution after the Second World War, those imbalanced patterns remain to this day. And so you see throughout the campaigns from across Scotland something that I do think is distinctive, and again it calls attention to some other historical examples, but in their own particular ways. And I just want to end with one, longer than I meant to talk for, but one image, this from 1983 from Ian McInnes. And I think here I want to just highlight that you could see today as something of a new energy scramble. So there is a perceived crisis, not just in the supplies of oil, but also the contestation that's coming from below. You see companies seeking to diversify what are seen as perhaps more unstable resources. and a drive, particularly in these islands, but also in the Western Isles, and you'll know in Shetland, towards wind farms. And the question, I guess, that was one more for you, but as I've been struck by as I've come to learn a bit more about this story and connect it with other stories, is how local people are treated in those processes, and what can we learn from history. It's not just an energy crisis, it's what some people call a polycrisis. It can be filled with despair. So I want to end on a slightly hopeful note. And so probably just a couple of things that I hope you can take away to think about international law and the purpose of international law, and so some of these institutions. I think you can see international law as a tool of governance, right? It doesn't necessarily always do good. It has its limits. It has justified, its history is in the justification for colonialism and imperialism. So that's a dark history. But it is also constantly being contested to be better and to deliver on its aspirations for a more peaceful and just world. And I'll just end with a quote from Orwell, because this is where I think it's not just about legal contestation and the power of law and the power of people, it's also about the importance of history. So Orwell says, and it's probably familiar to you, the most effective way to destroy people is to deny and obliterate their own understanding of their history. So history can be used as a tool of oppression, being rewritten by the victors and for powerful interests, or it can be written from below, from our experiences and our memories. This is the terrain of today's struggles for peace and justice, whether that's here in Orkney or around the world in the ways that all of our peoples are connected to this place. Thank you for listening. So I think I've left some time for questions, but I definitely went over, so I'm sorry.
Yeah. Can I kick off? It's really interesting. I'll get to questions from observation start to compare this with what happened around oil. You know, we have an equally rapacious industry, arguably, but arguably more so globally. It came here, in Shetland, and as you well know, albeit we had some leverage at the time because of individuals and just the urgency to get oil flowing in the UK kind of gave us a kind of a hand at Westminster, arguably. But at the same time, you know, we did basically give over the whole island to the oil industry, and you know, so we kind of accepted that. So I'm just maybe moving towards the question. Do you think that is because there's a different kind of political viewpoint of uranium versus oil, or was it just the sheer environmental impact of uranium? Might it not be perhaps more acceptable of oil because we kind of need it, and you know, we still get in our cars and we're kind of oil culture, the way that we're not uranium culture. So I just want you anything to observe on that.
Yeah, thank you for mentioning Flotter, because I didn't. I think uranium is different because of some things that happened, like 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl. It really shifts the kind of understanding of the dangers of those. There are terrible oil spills. And then obviously in '88 with Piper Alpha, I think that's a pretty shocking event, but there isn't a sense that this is happened because of poor management practices that actually are learned in offshore conditions where workers are treated even worse, and then it comes home to roost at Piper Alpha. So I think it's a really interesting one. I think also as little understanding as I do have of the complexities of Flotter and its history, one of the differences I think is that the prospect of jobs would have been quite different. It would have been a different kind of set of jobs that would, as in Shetland, provide actually some good jobs, even though it would be time limited, and everybody can see now that it is time limited. But I'm really grateful you mentioned that, yeah.
I'd like to say something else about that particular point. And I would say that it's largely economic. I think if the uranium deposit in Stromness and Yasmin had higher grades, there would be mining here. I'm absolutely certain of it.
Yeah, I think that's a good point.
And I think we've only got away with it was because it's not a good enough grade for them to do it. But I'm from the mining industry, environmental part, I have to say. But I know this industry really well, and if there's enough incentive, they would be here. So I think the main reason we don't have mining here is because it's not good enough.
Yeah.
That's all.
Yeah. And there remained other places where it could be mined.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Your point about like comparing it to wind farm is really, really interesting and very relevant. But I was just curious to see what you thought would be a better way of approaching it. Right. I understand people feel very hard done by when suddenly the farmer next door to them agreed to sell half the land to a wind farm or rent it to a wind farm company, whatever it is. But what would be a better way of, should it all be community owned, or what would be more, like how would you convince, because we need renewables, so how would you convince people that it's not going to do?
I would probably start from a premise of not convincing people, that you first of all have to have the conversation about the stakes involved, and everyone has to have a stake. People can't be forced. I mean, I have 4 kids. There is a lot of compromise that goes on and a lot of negotiation, and you can know that you have to have the outcome, but then the process is more important, I think, even than the outcome. I agree, there's no doubt that there is a crisis. But what we then end up not doing is thinking about, well, okay, all we've got to do is get all of this energy basically down south. We've got to get it to the urban centres. And meanwhile, we're producing AI that relies on even more of this energy. We produce Bitcoin that relies on more of this energy. We have servers so it's disconnected. And I think the first step has to be to step back and say, what for? What's it actually for? Community councils, I think, are really important. They're part of what is happening in the West Isles. They're not a solution because they can also be contested. You also will be familiar, part of the deals that were agreed at Sullom and to an extent with Flotter were so radical because they were unheard of. So systemically, there's something wrong there, right? Foreign companies coming in, making enormous profits of something that is natural, that is commonly owned. And I mean, I think that story it's a story of enclosure, but just manifest in a different way. I mean, I'm talking to a room that is like right at the front line of all of this, so you all will have far better ways of interpreting that. But as an outsider looking in, with that understanding of the patterning of these kinds of extractivist industries, I think we need to think about that mode as being the problem. Extracting the wind from here to take it elsewhere. Could we try a different mode? Yeah.
Can I ask another question?
Yeah.
How effective do you think protesting is now?
Well, why is it being prohibited? It's because it's incredibly effective.
Do you think it still is, despite how they're treating protesters? Do you think they still have power to change this?
Protest? I mean, I would not be a professor if it weren't for protest of 2 forms, right? Of the militant form and of the constitutionalist form. Women were not legal persons. Women could not be a lawyer until 1920.
Like right now, currently, how protests are being treated. I'm not disregarding protests in history, and I really think they're very important, obviously. But like right now, how shut down protests is it an effective way of getting your voice heard?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, I would always say that planning law is extremely valuable. And so I think there's an overlay of issues going on there. So one is the direct targeting by the state of non-violent civil disobedience, which has a long history and a long heritage. And the legal challenges to that, I am hopeful. I do think that it cannot possibly stand. That we move to terror repeatedly. I just like to believe we can't possibly be that Orwellian, but maybe we are. So I don't think that protest can always be snuffed out, because it's only a manifestation of the ways we talk at the table in our families. And I think that part of the issue is a deeper one, which you probably speak to as well, which is that it's also not only about protests and demonstrations. They can be very effective, but sometimes it's the stuff that goes on in the background, in the boring, in the mundane, in the technical. We see this also more broadly in social movements in international law. So there's this talk of how because the law, because the UK government, because of all these different things, law has become the language, the terrain on which we contest our politics. It's not ideology anymore, right? We don't have like these set ideological camps of socialism versus communism and anarchists and everything else. Everything is funneled through law, whether that's human rights, where there's all these different protections, and it juridifies the space. And that's a problem, because the law is a really elitist, expert-dominated space, right? You have to qualify, you have to sit exams. It's deeply exclusionary, whether it's to women or working class people or minorities. And law can justify all sorts of violence. So it's a really skewed terrain that we exist on right now. And yes, there's a space for legal challenge, so judicial reviews and strategic litigation. You're seeing this in climate justice as well, but it's often after the event. So it does pose a challenge. I mean, you're seeing it with Palestine as well. Huge amounts of activism. And actually, for some international lawyers, what we're seeing is a really paradigm moment for the international legal system. Because the series of ICJ decisions that have come out really now put it in the same category as South Africa. It's undeniable what is happening there. And yet governments are reacting against. So you have to have a legalized struggle these days. Yes, you have to protest and demonstrate in other ways. But I think there's also this question of how we build community in a very polarizing space. So I, again, have no solutions, but I still think it's worth struggling over in various different ways.
Just to follow on from that, I was wondering on your thoughts on international law more generally, when there's so many countries that are obviously in breach of it and there's no consequence or comeback from it. So what is the point of international law at that point?
Yeah, totally. And I mean, I think you feel that impunity most horrifically if you are a mother trying to give birth in Gaza right now. So I think that for us, not pontificating, but as an international lawyer, trying to say what the value of international law is, it has to be embedded in where that impunity is really playing out. My daughter's loving whatever she's watching. It just was too boring for her. It's always been a challenge. It's just like any other tool of governance. It can be something that is abused or used by powerful states. It can also be used to resist. And I think it's that classic, it gets overused a lot by Audre Lorde's point that, the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. Like, there are a lot of people who think that, and in international law and activists, that what's the point in using this language that is never going to do justice and can't be enforced and is constantly ignored by major states. And yet there are states like Palestine advocating in the ICJ saying, we're not abandoning international law. We're finally going to be the recognized state we should have been under the mandate system back in the League of Nations era. How dare you tell us to abandon international law now? So it's always been a really contested space. The same debates were had in the 1950s and 60s. Newly independent states gaining national liberation saying, well, we want Pan-Africanism, we want Pan-Arabism, we don't want these like state-based systems, but that was the mode in which they could engage. And it's not to over-romanticize any of those stories. I mean, a lot of those post-colonial states end up becoming, authoritarian states, rapaciously extractivist states. So I guess I can't abandon the project of international law because ultimately it is implicated in a project of peace and a project of justice. and it's one of the tools that can be used. I don't think it's the only tool, and it has its limits. At the end of the day, it's all politics, isn't it? I don't know if that's satisfactory. I mean, what do you think? I don't know.
No, I don't know. I mean, it seems to me that it needs to be enforced somehow, but I don't know how you do that.
I mean, some of the community enforcement that has happened, but again, it's always post facto. You know, things like the Truth and Justice Reconciliation Commissions, some degree of criminal culpability after some of this impunity and injustice. Again, you see it in quite boring areas like investment law. Actually, there are these spaces where you see huge pushbacks to, again, massive imbalances that have continued. It's not a simple story. But international legal institutions definitely tell themselves stories that they're making the world better, and that, you know, if only we could comply, things would be better. Yeah.
Just a quick one. Is that ban on uranium mining in Orkney still
it would have been superseded at devolution because it would have been part of a structure plan under the old pre-devolutionary settlement. So I'd have to look and see actually what's your current town, and because that was.
I know that back in the 70s and 80s, I wasn't here then, but I know people that were, and there was a lot of fundraising as to create a fund for protecting Orkney against nuclear or uranium mining, and that fund is, as far as I know, still in place, because somebody approached me recently, as in the last couple of years, and saying, do we really still need to have this fund just in case, rears its ugly head again? And I said, well, never say never, but I mean, I don't think it's likely, but I'm not going to be the one that says, disbanded that fund, because sod's law, especially now that so many countries are looking to what can we get from our own territory, like Trump and all the oil and the coal from his place. The same thing may apply here. If suddenly the Chinese or the South Africans or whatever cut off their supply of uranium, and they still want to go ahead with their push for nuclear power, then maybe they will start considering local.
So we've just got an agreement on small modular reactors that made the news. What's frustrating from a historian's perspective is the Nuclear Decommissioning Authority has restricted all of these files from the early agreements on nuclear energy sharing that were held with the US. So you can't even look to the history of how those were negotiated and agreed. And at a time when we're renewing a policy or at least a set of assumptions, you can't even look at the documents. And it's been going on now for almost a decade. And you put in your Freedom of Information request repeatedly into the National Archives and they say, oh no, these are held with the MOD because they're being considered as part of this wide-scale review. But that kind of wide-scale review is just seemingly never-ending, right at the moment that we're agreeing these new terms. So, yeah, it possibly could. I think also there is the impact of what has already happened. So some of the radioactive leakages from Dounreay, for example, leaking out onto the seabeds that are now being disrupted by a lot of the cabling that's coming in for the wind farm. So, a lot of these things are connected and they don't go away necessarily.
Oh, yeah. It's great.
Can I just ask you, I just wondered what you thought about, well, I was really interested in what you were saying about the NATO base in Storm, the prospect of that, of people away, those sorts of things which you just don't hear about, obviously not aware, I certainly wasn't aware of that. And I wondered, and one of the things I was aware of from a holiday a while ago was that Saxon board is reopened and is active, and as I understand it at the moment, was welcomed on in terms of new tech jobs, children in schools, families online, and all the things that we share with that community. And I was thinking about reading the paper this morning yesterday or whatever, about how the UK has just committed to working with the Norwegian naval forces and developing weapons really for destroying Russian submarines and so on. And this whole shift that we're getting in the geopolitics of the North Atlantic, and it's happening very fast. And I wonder whether you see implications that should we all be looking at the planning applications? Because everything that might be, I don't know. You know, it feels a little bit like that to me. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of things in that, I think. So one would be sort of the race for space and Saxiford, because the RAF base did close down, and that was a real, it was catastrophic actually to the local communities who had ended up settling there, whose kids were there. And this development of the spaceport was seen as, you know, potentially bringing jobs, relatively good jobs, back to an area. And then having visited and spoken to some people, you know, it's become really clear that there may be more than was bargained for on that site. So for instance, there are 3 launch pads that are being developed. One that is kind of in the news the most is the one that, you know, the launch has been delayed, but, you know, is probably the closest with this German company. But the American potential site is fascinating for its structural exclusion. So they've demanded that it's completely separate from the rest of the launches. And obviously all of this is being developed with the purposes, initially at least, or at least publicly, for civilian application. But more and more satellites are being developed to actually be able to knock out other satellites. So that's kind of, you know, the stuff that then Saxiford is becoming implicated in that local community. But again, with very little discussion other than the issue of jobs, which is no doubt a massive issue. But I suppose the point is, you know, more than you bargained for. And then how do you disentangle yourself from that sort of militarized site? Likewise in the Western Isles, and it's interesting that you said that, you know, uranium, the only reason it didn't happen is because it just wasn't enough uranium. It's a little bit that same story with Stornoway, and it's not to belittle the huge amounts of effort and activism that went in, but the reason for NATO looking to have its forward base in Stornoway is because there was a socialist communist coalition that was about to get elected in the 1970s, was very close to being elected, and their immediate thing was to be closing the NATO base because it's the forward base at Keflavik. So there were geopolitics involved there that meant that maybe it was slightly more speculative. If that base had closed, the question we could really ask ourselves is, would Stornoway have had that NATO base anyway? Because it had to go somewhere. So if they'd lost that position in Iceland, and I suppose the sting in the tail, if you're thinking about protest movements and successes and resistance to some of these military or militarized sites, is you may be familiar that in the US there's a huge military base at Balavanek, and it's kind of completely taken over Benbecula, but also it's the largest firing range to sea in the world. So the shipping is often closed. And every year there are massive kind of exercises with NATO troops firing the missiles that would launch, for example, a nuclear warhead. Now that was contested in the 1950s. There was huge community opposition to it. It looked like they might have had a reprieve. There was another, as they called it, a flick of the pen in Whitehall, and it sort of seemed to disappear. And then it reared its head in the 1960s. And now it's so part of that economy, and so part of everyone is connected to that base in some way. And so it generates that kind of dependency where it's unthinkable now for it to close. So it's fascinating that Keep NATO Out campaign, they targeted the base, but they couldn't find the supporters that they had on Lewis and Harris, because it's almost as if it had already destroyed that way of life. It had already brought in actually positive jobs to that community, so that the loss that was a huge part of the 50s campaign, the loss of Gaelic culture, the loss of community, there's all sorts of other kind of religious sides to that because it's a huge Catholic majority population. But the shift had already happened. And people could see some benefits from that. And now, again, in the noughties, sort of in 2008, 2009, it looked like the base might close. And in fact, it was local resistance to the closure that kept it open. And it's now run by Kinetic, which is just a private company of the MOD. I don't know what the hopeful story in that is. I suppose you will know far better than I the tensions for having jobs and having a kind of input into a local economy. I suppose the people who were there on the ground both at the time and looking back were frustrated by the form of dependency that it created, because once you had those jobs as the only jobs, there were no other jobs. So it just became a process of extinction of other forms of life.
Can I ask, as these protests were able to prevent the mining of uranium in Orkney, internationally, what laws are used to enforce resistance from local communities for this mining? Because I come from Nigeria.
Oh wow, well that would have been part of my talk.
Yes.
That's a huge part of the story. I'm sorry for leaving it out.
And a very oil-rich nation, yes, but local resistance doesn't count at all.
Yeah.
Any mining, and then, for example, like when we talk of uranium now, I think France has just been evicted from Niger Republic. Yes, and France has been evicted from Niger Republic. I think Russia. The people that have been invited now to take over the money, which will affect the supply chain of uranium for anywhere nuclear sites are operated some way, somehow. I think uranium for the USA comes from Russia. A lot of it still comes from Russia. Yeah. So I think there's also some deposit of uranium in Nigeria, and they mine those things anyway, with or without local resistance. If there's local resistance, they will do it anyway because they have the power to do so. So what laws are there to structurally implement the purchase of this uranium from places where there are no resistance in the local communities?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say for every example that it's the same, but I mean, the Nigeria case is not dissimilar to the Indonesia case. So you get huge importation of foreign investment into these states, and then lo and behold, you get military governments propped up, huge human rights violations. Activists like Ken Saro-Wiwa and various others of these resistance movements were highlighting the environmental degradation probably long before it was clear within Western states, because it was all happening literally on the ground in Nigeria. But in terms of the laws that govern them, it's both a consequence of empire and the kinds of constitutions that post-colonial states were left with. I mean, many states articulated their own constitutions, but a lot of my colleagues who've written about post-colonial states, a really great guy called Balakrishnan Rajagopal, who's written a book called International Law from Below, shows that they were left with constitutions that were for an administrative extractivist state. But because of the exigencies of independence, they had to get a constitution together. And then what you see in the later decades is the renegotiation of those independence documents, because it just creates a kleptocracy. If the state is set up to go in with these foreign investors and to have these relationships and to extract the resources from the ground, it's already not working for the benefit of the people. So I think that the colonial legacy is part of that story. I think the international law story really only kind of emerges through nationalization projects. So when those states decide that this is our economic sovereignty, these are our resources, then you see some really appalling reactions against what were lawful measures. I mean, they were lawful within those states, just like they were in the UK, but they were lawful in international law as well. Even the history that I've told you about, justifying colonial extractivism, even that granted, it was legal to justify your copper mines in Allende's Chile, or your oil companies in various of the Arab states. And so that was the legal overlay. But then what you get is threats to use force, or you get the toppling of democratically elected governments. So there's just a sort of, as you said, there's this impunity that takes place. Again, I always want to end on like a hopeful note, because, I want to tell my kids that like it's worth the struggle. I mean, for God's sake, otherwise the future's just gone. And I do think that if it's our states, the states that we are now resident in, we owe a special duty. I mean, it's like with Palestine. Britain is at the source of what is happening. We owe a special duty to Palestinians because it is our government that created that mess, alongside many others. South Africa is the same. Those struggles do need to be fought. And what's interesting, I think, just from the nuclear side, is that there's a particular form of protesting and activism against nuclear weapons when you're in a nuclear-armed state that I think is very different to if you're in a non-nuclear-armed state. But you can create solidarities together. And I think that's what you're seeing at the moment with the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. We haven't had time to kind of talk about it, and you could do a whole talk on it. But I think solidarity networks among states, among people within states, they demonstrate that we're not these enclosed, bounded peoples. We've always moved. We've always been connected. And that, I think, is where we get our strength from.
One last question. So how do people in those marginalized communities like that, how do they get their voices heard?
It's a good question. So, I mean, they have a lot of the answers. On the ground, I think you often will know the solution that fits best. And I think it's about amplifying those voices. So over the various decades of the decolonization revolution, you had people harnessing the power of media. So I told you about the new international economic order. There was also a new world information order that was kind of put forward, which would have actually ended up in a very radically different place to where we are now. But so harnessing those kinds of media outlets, harnessing solidarity networks. I mean, pre the phones, which I remember, pre the internet, which I also remember, people were really connected. There were newsletters and pamphlets, and people went to different places and they experienced at first hand the hypocrisy of empire. I mean, that's actually a strand that has run right through my study of peace campaigning in Scotland, the number of people that are confronted with the reality of empire. And it completely changes their life, whether they're a missionary or a Peace Corps campaigner, or they go to somewhere in Africa and they say, what the hell? Like, what is this? This is appalling, and they realize that this legacy of violence. So, yeah, I think that this amplification of those voices, I think they connect themselves up in movements. So I talked about the indigenous communities. There have been various moves to have their sovereignty recognised both in international law but domestically. I think that's part of the story, and it's probably also just people sharing their own experiences.
I think I have a question. So, yes, we need to get Indigenous voices heard. An academic community in imperial science is often rejected. Mm-hmm. And then in resistance movements on the ground, when we are working in sovereignty, we need to speak like lawyers. It all kind of comes back to law. I think I work with some of your colleagues in Glasgow on food sovereignty and land justice in Scotland. Yeah. And it all comes back to law. So even on the ground, we need to start learning like lawyers to advocate through policy, then to go into local government and kind of go through the ranks that way. and it's like one pathway, but then like what Joseph was saying, like marginalised communities on the ground, and then when we talk about Indigenous people like Orkneyans, like the Western Isles folks, like even seeing visually in your presentation how they were all happening at the one time and they were all separate battles, that was wonderful to see. But I think my question is, how do we actually get the information that we need academically, socially, politically from Indigenous local voices, because they know what they need and we know that what's not working, to feed up the chain, to actually change the law so that the law reflects what is needed to change on the ground to protect the rights that it's meant to uphold.
Yeah.
So how do we actually mobilise that, because we know what we need to do. So I think that's my question.
I mean, I think there's two things probably in there. I think one is, again, if you look back to these historical campaigns, there's a huge amount of education that goes on. So, you know, I speak to some campaigners and I just start to glaze over when they tell me all the technicalities of what reprocessing plutonium actually means. I'm like, what? And then they say, well, I just had to learn this. I just had to learn this on the ground.
Yeah.
You know, so I think it is about, you know, power and elites are entrenched. I mean, they're a lot more unstable than they would like us to know. But power is far more fragile, I think, than we are led to believe, right? I think, I mean, this is just kind of me speaking, sort of, again, probably as a mother and off the cuff, but I think the levers we just need to pull at them more, because actually you can see that when empires fall or when governments fall, it's like a little thing that just pushes them over the edge. You're like, how on earth did that lead to the collapse of that? But it's a lot more, it's an artifice. It's an artifice that purposely excludes us and our voices and movements because we're dangerous. You know, women were dangerous, so they had to be just legally nullified. And I think that again, there's something to be learned there. I do think that learning your legal rights has been always a characteristic of protest. So in some of the archives, I see the little, what they call bust cards, right? So what to do when you get arrested. And it just tells you what your rights are. And there's always been like legal observers who are telling you what your rights are and that, no, they can't do that. And yes, you can do that. And, you know, so I think that education about law is important. And actually, it's a problem with this legalized world we live in because we're not teaching all of our kids their legal rights and the intricacies of law. So that maybe is how we could change education a bit, is make it a bit more civically suited. And I do think that you see kind of movements from the ground up. You mentioned Indigenous communities using the language of law. I think there's a epistemic point to make there. So rather than the things that they're talking about, the substance, the ontology, how they're doing it is the thing we need to learn from. So the fact that there's this understanding that, you know, laws are made in these particular ways in corridors of power, and we could question a lot of the laws that come out like that. But the better laws are the laws that are subject to massive consultation and huge contestation. And, you know, there's some of the best laws that we end up with. And so maybe that is the point when you're thinking about movements on the ground. It's actually the process in which that is being conducted that matters as much as the outcome or the means, the end that's being fought for. So the kinds of forums amongst Indigenous communities, or the pulling down of UNDRIP, so the language of the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, but being articulated in very particular ways, to make connections with others. So not just about food or seed sovereignty, but about broader land reform and land justice movements. And I guess maybe today that would be similar, right? The questions of land reform and land justice have not gone away, and they're deeply connected to these questions of energy and infrastructure and extractivism. So I guess it's, for me, I think the thing to look to is how we do things, just as much as what we're actually saying and what we're struggling over. It's probably a bit of a non-answer, but yeah.
I think what I'm going to say follows on from the discussion and looking at your image that you have there. The challenge you have with wind onshore and a sense of unfairness and injustice is that we've got property rights So the industry works within that system, makes agreements around property rights with the individual landowners. And it was interesting how, talking about land reform, we look at there, everybody's talking to people in the Glasgow estate, and so there's a community right to buy there, so they own the land, and they make a decision about how many wind turbines, and they take the profit, because they own the land, they get the right. So, you know, they've got a much bigger stake in what's going on. I was also talking to them about, there's an offshore development, can get to one point eventually happening, but they needed waiving over the land. And the community were saying, I talked to Mark and they said, we didn't realise how much power we had through the ownership of the land to really screw a fair deal out of that operation. You mentioned enclosure earlier, and the trouble with on land, it's all happened hundreds of years ago, and you know, right to buy, it's incredibly difficult, expensive, and refashioning the kind of land-based system. But in the marine environment at the minute, we are enclosing land. So you see, we are creating property rights that are tradable, and we're creating a permanent right to be there for agriculture in perpetuity. Offshore wind farms, global corporations, it's the quarries of the world that own these things. And we're creating a leases for 70 years. But very few people in this room are in 70 years, even one. And
she's not listening,
they're tradable. But nobody is interested in the fact that we're kind of giving away creating these property rights and potentially an unjust system like we have on land. In the marine environment, it seems to be, it's like the debates around plans all about not upsetting each other and you know, about sort of famous like that, but nobody's actually talking about the fact that we're actually creating property rights in an unjust system right now, the way that we did hundreds of years ago in land and we often regret. It's happening right now, and there's zero debate about it.
I think create sovereignty on a crown estate though.
It's
Because like the marine is like off the crown estate, so
yeah,
you create sovereignty
you
on a
create
crown
things like
estate.
70-year leases that can be traded, and you create the property right there. So there was this kind of drip process. So I don't really have a question, apologies.
No, I mean,
had any observations around that? Why is there just no debate about this?
well, I mean, I suppose the question is where would the debate happen? So the one benefit of planning processes is that there is then mandated, you have to have a transparent process. Now, there are forums that are already kind of accepted as being part of that process. When you're talking about what are effectively monarchical rights, right, crown prerogatives, essentially to dish out what they want to, then it just really is about government policy. And the levers in there, particularly from communities that are further away from power, it is so much harder. And, you know, I do think that there are probably ways for communities to think really radically and transformatively about what kind of alternatives might be put forward. Sovereignty comes from international law, you know, but it's a complete fiction. I mean, it's totally made up. It's like, you know, they're just talking about this thing that happened in 1648. I mean, it never happened that way anyway. And, you know, this idea of sovereign states is just farcical. You know, where it happens, where the state makes itself is constantly being struggled for, and it's on the ground. But it suited a certain basically civilizational narrative to have states that were recognized as these sovereign entities right at the moment when they were all being, I mean, what was Scotland like in 1648? I mean, isn't that quite close to the time when Norwegian sovereignty shifted? I mean, these things were massively in flux. So I guess it is about contesting some of those completely taken for granted powers and assumptions. And probably nowhere clearer has that been. I mean, you know, yours is a far more actually engaged and interesting and live issue right now. But things like the prerogative to use force, I mean, people might remember the Iraq War in 2003. There had obviously been others, like the 56 invasion of the Suez Crisis. But there you have a crown prerogative, right? A monarchical power telling a democracy that we can go to war without any kind of parliamentary oversight. And that's the law. I mean, and then you see some of the biggest protests the countries had ever seen over that. So I do think it's about contesting those legacies. I mean, if we think about it, democracy isn't even 100 years old. We're not in 2028 yet. You know, we will celebrate the universal franchise, a centenary of the universal franchise. So, like, I think we're still finding our feet. You know, we are not the oldest democracy in the world. If you think of all the, what were they called, like the rotten boroughs and some guy in Scotland going for an election, there's like one other elector and it was his brother or whatever. You know, it was a land kleptocracy, I think, if we were to look back honestly at our history. So why not create reforms for justice over these rights to land or to the sea, and recommoning. And I mean, you see recommoning as a mode and a method right across different communities.
It's so difficult to do.
I bet.
But we're just, you know, I fear in 50 years' time we couldn't see carved up and we're going to go, how the hell did that happen? But undoing this is going to be my own process.
Yeah, but it has been attempted. I mean, I think the thing is, it's constantly been attempted and contested and struggled for. I'll just tell you one really quick little story. So when the age of satellites starts, right? So in 1957 you get Sputnik, and then you get this kind of race for space. There is a treaty that's signed between all the equatorial states, and they claim vertical sovereignty. So for the first time, they said, you can't put these satellites over in the geo orbit, because actually that is the extent of our sovereignty. It extends right from the land and the seabed to the vertical, right into space. Now, they lost. But it was a bit of a paradigm moment, and they lost because they didn't have the technology to compete in the same kind of level. And again, there's reasons for that. But that treaty does exist, and it stakes a claim in a way that shows that you can make radical propositions. I think you're probably better making them on the ground. You know, the obvious point here is you may have the property rights in the land, but you don't own the wind. I mean, nobody can own the wind, and the wind is the common energy that's being harnessed. Tell me how that struggle goes.
Yeah.
Sometimes we need to kind of put things in perspective as well, because although we're talking, and all of us that are campaigning in other different areas think, you know, you've been doing this for years and nothing happens, and you know, you're banging your head against a brick wall. But when you first started your talk, you talked about the Western areas going to places in the US and places in Australia to test their weapons, etc. But Russia were doing that in Kazakhstan, and there's whole areas of Kazakhstan that are dead. And currently there's uranium mining in Kazakhstan, and those people have no voice. And the things that are happening, the birth deformities and everything like that is just appalling. And they have virtually no voice.
Yeah, but just remember that the Soviet Union was also an empire. So I think we forget this. You know, there was a huge resettlement, a movement of populations into Eastern Europe. It acted as an empire. So, I mean, sometimes I think we can lose that it was an empire. So it behaved in many of those same ways. But yeah, absolutely. At the same time, you get massive contestation by those local people. I mean, only in 2015, you have the chutzpah in southwest United States who are banning uranium on the land that goes through on the roads that go through their reservation. And they're now in a federal contest with the US government because Trump is just bulldozing through, quite literally. But I think, you know, that struggle is visceral for a lot of communities, and we probably need to hold that with us, even as it feels despairing.
Any more questions? Anybody? Okay. Well, thank you everybody for coming in, and I think it's been a really excellent talk, and tying it into the international scene, superb. So thank you very much.